going to start with Fred Schueler to talk about a possible hibernacular limitation of a snake species in Ontario.
So this is about one of the weirdnesses of living in Eastern Ontario, which is that we have a whole lot of snakes that come up to the edge of the Frontenac Arch or the edge of what was the Champlain Sea, and we just don't have them here. And so there's my abstract, which you could all have seen. In 2007, I was asked to do a species at risk inventory. The species at risk, the federal species at risk had just come in, and they wanted to put a new garage on this highway yard, which would have been about 6 meters by 8 meters in size. And Dave Sebring was too busy, and so he passed it on to me. And I talked to all the guys there, and there were no milk snakes, even though one had been found nearby. But I looked at the range of the milk snake, and this site was at the edge of the range, and basically the milk snake was found on the shield and along ways along the Ottawa and St. Lawrence rivers, and so that led me to wonder what it was about Eastern Ontario that was inhospitable to milk snakes. And one thing, of course, is maybe all the places they might have hibernated were filled up by mud from the Champlain Sea, or maybe there was something about the bedrock of the Canadian Shield Frontenac Arch connection that was better for hibernation, or some kind of combination of these factors. And so there's the range of the milk snake from the Ontario Herp Atlas, which has records up to 2019, and you can see that a lot of the records in the eastern edge of the range are the yellow squares, which indicate that the square has only had a record since 1990. And then this is my field notes and a road-killed milk snake from Bishop's Mills, where we live here, and this was in the year 2000. And the crazy thing is that, Francis and Joyce Cook moved into their farm 4 kilometers from here 50 years ago, and we've been here since 1978, and both of us
since 1970.
Both of us, looking for reptiles and amphibians, and all of a sudden, here we have a milk snake. And there's a picture of Bishop's Mills where the milk snake was found. And so we sort of nosed this around on Facebook, and Steve Marks commented that snakes do get carried around on vehicles. And so this may have been a milk snake that was in somebody's wood pile that they were moving around. Of course, you're not supposed to move wood around because of the emerald ash borer. But then we went to our local nature list, and Stu Hamill over on the other side of the Wolford Bog said that he'd been looking at things since 1978, and he had the first milk snake showed up on his land in 2014. So there seems to be some sort of an expansion of the range of milk snakes that's going on, and there's a bunch of other people who also had milk snakes relatively recently. Now the classic not found off of the Frontenac Arch species is the black rat snake. And here's the map of the black rat snake, and there's this record up near Kempville. People carry rat snakes around, and they can be found outside of the places where there's population. So I don't think that indicates a range extension. So the fact that these records have showed up suggests that there has been some kind of a substantial change, and maybe something has made the limestone hibernacula more friendly to milk snakes, although we don't really have any idea what it might be. We've had intensified agriculture, but we've also had various reductions in some of the, maturing of some of the woods, and we don't know where these milk snakes would hibernate, so we don't really know what might be causing this sort of incursion of milk snake records onto the limestone plain. And another species that has a similar limitation is the ribbon snake. And as we all know, garter snakes can get misidentified as ribbon snakes. And I don't know what those old records in extreme eastern Ontario represent. And then, of course, the decay snake or brown snake is also, as we say in eastern Ontario, it's found as far east as Athens. And we found these yellow squares here represent the ones we found along Highway 401 when we were doing the Highway 401 in 2014 and 2015. And then, of course, the other thing is that the decay snake shows up in Montreal as a species at risk in Quebec. And it looks like from the New York State Herp Atlas here that they're also not found along the lower St. Lawrence in New York State. So there may be something about a lack of hibernacula in the land that was flooded by the Champlain Sea and doesn't have, the Adirondack Mountains on that side of the river. So on our land here in Bishop's Mills, we've got this, we've had some kind of change in how at least the water snakes hibernate, because we've got a pond that we dug in 1983, and we didn't have a water snake there until 2012, and then 2 in 2016, and then in 2020, where this photograph is from, there was a bunch of them, and in 2021 about an equal number, although we didn't get that one highlighted in pink. So there's some kind of change. Maybe it has something to do with the maturing of the cedar bush behind the pond, or something about what we've done or haven't done. And so I always think of these big box stores as future snake hibernacula, because you can think of them as collapsing and then maybe spreading some soil over them. They're constructed, incidentally, so that they don't have any use except being what they are, and that minimizes the property taxes they have to be, because they don't have any resale value. So maybe we should go after them for snake hibernacula. And of course, there's guidance on how to construct snake hibernacula, especially whooped by the Toronto Zoo. And this is their picture of what a snake hibernacula might be. And I've had the idea that if we could find a really good site, it would be interesting to construct sort of optimal hibernacula and see to what extent snake populations increase. And now that we've got these milk snakes moving into the general area, to see if milk snake populations could show up and increase after one made a really big hibernaculum, a really good hibernaculum. And where's the cursor? And so, to reference my talk later this afternoon, if we put in the Francis Cook Memorial Museum of Long-Term Herpetological Monitoring, this is a site where there's nice bedrock, and if one were to dig a 4-meter deep hole in the bedrock and fill it with the Toronto Zoo kind of stuff, it might make a really, really nice hibernaculum. And that's about that. I don't think I've spent 15 minutes, but there's the acknowledgement slide, and I can send a copy of the paper in the chorus about the increased records in elk snakes, if anybody wants to have it.
All right, thanks, Fred. You didn't take 15 minutes. Is there anyone that has any questions? I don't see any in the chat. If you also go down to the reactions button in the Zoom ribbon and click raise hand, then you can, oh,
I've got
I
it.
need to find out
Oh,
how to
there's-
see the
there's
raised
that.
hand. There we go. Okay, so yes, thank you, Fred. You're getting some claps. And Nick, you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute, go ahead.
Morning, Fred.
All right.
Thanks for the talk. Interesting. So when you say that the hibernacular would have been filled with mud by the Champlain Sea, so if you dig down, is there just no in the bedrock? There's just no interstitial spaces, but that the snakes would be in. And what are the species that you do have in your area? Where are they usually overwintering?
Well, that's the problem, is I don't know anything about any of that.
Okay, fair enough.
The thing about the Champlain Sea is that if there's big areas, all of the sort of South Nation drainage to the east of us, we're just, the Leda clay, there's just a layer of clay, and it's easy to visualize that there wouldn't be hibernacula. It would reduce the quality of hibernacula in just solid clay. Around here, we've got either clay or dunes or just exposed bedrock, because we didn't have the solid covering of clay, and I just don't have any idea what the effects are. The one experience we've had with an identified hibernaculum was when they sort of graded up the road across from us in 1983. The garter snakes suddenly found that was a good place, and we sort of caught them as they came out, and Francis Cook measured them and marked them, and we had about 100 garter snakes in that one little hole beside the road. But then when a few years later, they paved the road, and that covered up the hole, and we didn't have any more there. So this is all very conjectural.
In the trees, now when the trees grow bigger, they
Right.
might have, their roots might pry some bigger spaces in the rock, because there are cracks that go down in the bedrock. But the limestone, Smiths Falls limestone plain basically is mostly a table. It's like a table with a little bit of soil on it. And where it dips down, there can be some deposits of clay or some deposits of gravel. But so on our land, there's not very many cracks, but there are apple trees that find cracks, and there are cedar trees that find cracks. So it's like a parkland, and the trees are only growing where they can get their roots into the ground, into the rock. So as the trees grow bigger, maybe there'd be more hibernaculum like places for the snakes, but they'd have to be able to find them from the surface.
Yeah. Are there big formica mounds or anything like that? I don't remember seeing them when I was in your neighborhood before.
No, there's no big ant hills. I just don't know.
Hey,
Okay.
I have a story. I have a story. I'd love to show my little video, but we don't have it ready. I was out, which spring was this? Last spring,
Last spring.
2020?
Yeah.
Fred asked me to get his minnow trap out of the pond. And so I went, and I was standing there and noticed a little movement, and there was a pile of water snakes, maybe 3 water snakes, and a little bit over to the side, another pile. And they would go back and forth between these 2 piles. And I'd never seen anything like that in our pond before. And then there was this little garter snake, and it was ranging back and forth, and it would go and visit each of the piles of water snakes and just like go onto them and then leave. And the day before, we'd had a grass fire, and there'd been a big female who couldn't get down into a hole deep enough. There was a hole, but her body burned. And this was, I figured was a little male who was looking for her. And he even climbed up onto a dogwood bush about chest height on me, about maybe a 1.5 feet away from my face, and looked up at me as if to say, "Have you seen her?" And he was really agitated. His movements were just, he was frantic. He was looking for his lady. And I think Fred says that they're related enough, the water snakes and the garter snakes, that they might smell similar. And so he was smelling these piles of snakes, and he'd go visit them, but there were no stripes. So that's my story, and I've been told I should turn it into a children's book.
That sounds lovely. Thank you for the story, Alita. So up next is Nick Cairns. He's giving a 5-minute talk, and he's going to let it snow for greater shorthorn lizards.
So as Hannah mentioned, my name is Nick Cairns, and I'm going to be talking about every herpetologist's favorite subject, and that is snow and its imminent arrival and perhaps retention. So in particular, I'm talking about the subnevian. This is an environment under the snowpack. It maintains stable temperatures near freezing because of the insulation provided by snow and the heat released from soil that has been collected during warmer times. It provides protection for many species that remain active under the winter, think small mammals, but it also provides stability for those species that enter dormancy, think peepers or other frogs that are freeze tolerant. Unfortunately, this critical habitat feature is in decline, notably in the Northern Great Plains. And so here we see the percent day snow covers that have reduced about 6 million kilometers squared between 2008 and 1971. So we've lost a lot of the subnevian, especially in the shoulder seasons. But we don't really know how this affects ectotherms, especially in such extreme environments as the Northern Great Plains, where we can see air temperatures ranging 80 degrees Celsius easily in a year and 30 or more degrees Celsius in a day. So one particular species that I think is particularly at risk from this is Phrynosoma hernandesi. So overwintering sites appear to be range limiting for many species, in particular for herps. These horned lizards are very habitat specific already, really just living in these bare paw shale patches in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And they're known to brumate at very shallow depths, like 7 centimeters shallow. So extremely shallow, considering that the frost line here is well more than a meter most years. There have been a couple studies into overwintering these species, but no one has ever quantified the overwintering conditions that these lizards experience or have available to them. As climate change appears to be exacerbating the trends of snow loss, I set out to determine if the coulees in areas that retain snow tend to provide a thermal stable environment that might be selected for these animals, and to determine if snow retention is reflected in overwintering survival of a small population. So to do this, much of it will actually be descriptive, but if I can describe the general areas where lizards do overwinter and the areas where they do not, then we can build a rough selective microclimate that these animals are using. These two pictures are the same site in the fall and midwinter, and you can see how much snow is retained. Now I'm going to go and put out thermal loggers at sites where lizards are known to congregate. And then I'm also going to randomly distribute the rest of the loggers that I have across the site using stratified sampling. I'm then going to measure the amount of snow on a weekly basis for depth and retention at these sites where I have loggers. And then in the summer, I'm going to do summer encounter surveys to get a proxy of abundance and hopefully year-over-year abundance. This has a number of uses, both for intrinsic species knowledge and conservation applications. If a species is not protected in a national park, where is it protected? And maybe we should reassess its current threat status. And with that, it's a 5-minute talk, so that's why I'm burning through it so quickly. But I wanted to thank the Horned Lizard Conservation Society that provided me some money to do this, and Lori Piepenbrink, who provided them the money to provide me. I also received support in the form of data loggers from Pam and from Steve Lougheed, as well as some really awesome assistance from Adam Sprott, who lent me or who came down and flew a drone for me so we can do some really cool modeling in the next version of this project. And then I had lots of great help finding lizards from Noah and Adam Johnson. Adam Sprott came down, as well as my family. And then Parks Canada provided me the permits to do this. So if, I'll address questions at the end of this session. But thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. Right on time. Like we said, we'll answer questions at the end of the next talk. This is going to be Johnny Choquette. He's giving a 15-minute talk about identifying connectivity for urban Massasaugas.
All right. Good afternoon, Canadian herpetologists. I'm Jonathan Choquette. I'm a lead biologist with Wildlife Preservation Canada on the Ojibwe Prairie Reptile Recovery Program down at Windsor. Today, I'll be presenting for 15 minutes on a study conducted by myself with co-authors Dr. Corry and Matt Macpherson titled Identifying Potential Connectivity for an Urban Population of Rattlesnakes in a Canadian Park System. So in the face of ongoing habitat loss and fragmentation, maintaining an adequate level of landscape connectivity is needed to encourage dispersal between habitat patches and reduce the extinction risk faced by fragmented wildlife populations. At the Ojibwe Prairie in southwestern Ontario, a declining population of Massasauga rattlesnakes persists in fragmented tallgrass prairie remnants in an urban park system. So we know that lack of connectivity at the fine scale results in genetic fragmentation for Massasaugas. Just take this example from Ohio, where it only took 1 kilometer of unsuitable land to genetically fragment these 5 subpopulations. And we know that isolated subpopulations of Massasaugas are more likely to succumb to localized extirpation events. At Ojibwe Prairie in the 70s, we had 4 isolated subpopulations. By the 2010s, we're down to just 1. And so in 2018, the Ontario government response statement said, okay, look, we need to protect and improve the quality of existing habitat and increase habitat connectivity for Ojibwe at Ojibwe Prairie. But where do we do that? So species-specific GIS-based connectivity modeling tools are widely used for large vertebrates at the broad scale to identify important corridors for maintaining landscape connectivity. Now, unfortunately, these techniques are not applied as often in urbanizing landscapes or for animals with small home ranges such as reptiles, despite their potential as a defensible approach to identify, prioritize, and justify corridors between protected areas. So the use of empirical data would help to evaluate connectivity models so we can better understand their application in urban landscapes. Now, the goal of this study, therefore, was to identify locations of potential connectivity for Massasaugas in an urbanizing landscape using a GIS cost surface modeling approach. And we expect a valid Massasauga connectivity model to intersect roads where relatively high rates of crossing attempts occur. So we're going to evaluate it with road mortality data. Now, this work was originally conducted for my master's thesis. There's me defending right there. It took a little while, but recently was updated and accepted for publication last year in the peer-reviewed journal Land. Encourage you all, if you're interested, check it out. If it's helpful, maybe you could cite it in your next manuscript. So I'm going to run you through the methods using our graphical abstract here. So the first step, what we did was we identified a study area, and within that, we identified these 5 core Massasauga habitat blocks. And it's between these blocks that we modeled potential connectivity. You see them in blue there. The next step was we built a detailed land cover base map by assembling, digitizing, reclassifying 4 separate data sets. Now, number 3 is we converted that base map into a raster format with a 15-meter cell size and 19 different land cover classes. So this was the foundation for all the rest of our modeling. And then step 4 is we use the ArcGIS extension called Corridor Design to run a habitat suitability model and a habitat patch model. So to do this, we assigned each land cover class of the 19 a relative habitat suitability score from 1 all the way to 100 using evidence from the Massasauga literature. So these scores were used to convert that raster base map into a grayscale map reflecting the gradations of habitat suitability. You see that there. And then the patch model used the suitability map to identify patches of highly suitable habitat that were at least 5 hectares in size. These became what's called the suitable breeding patches, and it was these that were used as start and end points for the model. Step 5 at the top there, we identified the potential connectivity pathways between each of those 5 population blocks by running a cost distance model, again in that corridor design tool. This produced these layered permeability swaths, so it's successively showing the most to least permeable zones of the landscape for our target species. Now, the next step was from those outputs, we isolated and mapped these relevant permeability swaths to identify what we called connectivity pathways. So these are distinct variable width corridors between each population block. And finally, we compared the location and width of our potential connectivity pathways at road crossings to the location of snake roadkill hotspots. Now, we used roadkill hotspots based on data from 5 local snakes and argue that these are good proxies for attempted crossings by Massasaugas. And then we define hotspots as 1 or more adjoining 100-meter road segments with relatively high amounts of snake mortality. So what did we find? Well, we identified 7 high permeability pathways between our 5 core habitat blocks, identified here as PCP, potential connectivity pathway 1 through 7. These depict the most permeable 0.1% and 1% of the landscape. We also identified 9 additional lower permeability pathways at a finer scale, because as the permeability threshold increased beyond 1%, pathways widened and even developed these additional strands. You can see those additional strands in white here. So this example, we had the high permeability pathways, PCP 1 and 2 in the darkest gray, and then we have these additional loops, these distinct connectivity loops or strand that we identified as other PCPs. Now, next, we used 182 snake road mortality data points, and we compared hotspots on 5 roads to where connectivity pathways intersected those roads. So the hotspots were on average 380 meters wide, and then the pathways, the connectivity pathways, were 35 meters wide on average where they crossed roads. So in all 5 cases, the connectivity pathways intersected roads through or directly adjacent to those mortality hotspots. Now, second, we also used a much larger road mortality data set, so 384 records in this case, this time using the wider PCPs of the 1% swath, and these were almost 300 meters on average where they intersected roads. And essentially, we wanted to compare snake mortality rate within those stretches of road intersected by the connectivity pathways to the mortality rate elsewhere along those roads. And essentially, we found that the number of dead snakes recorded on road stretches overlapped by the connectivity pathways was on average double the number of dead snakes found elsewhere on those roads. So in general, we feel like the model performed quite well. However, its ability to predict locations of road crossing events did vary across each of those 5 study roads, suggesting its predictive power was somewhat inconsistent across the landscape. There's also some cases where the most permeable path followed some questionable course based on the air photos. So a model could be improved in a few ways. One could be the base map investing more time in actually increasing the accuracy of, in particular, the 2 Sistrurus classes, urban pervious and urban impervious. And also, we did include a number of land cover classes beyond those in the Sistrurus database. And this really increased the accuracy of our model. But we think that we could improve our model even more by adding classes for roads that show road culverts, bridges, and and roadside swales. So that said, the modeling of these successive corridor swaths probably does provide some degree of buffering anyways for those errors in cell classification or land cover data, which otherwise that buffering would be non-existent if you're only modeling like a least cost path. So our results do depict the most permeable portions of the landscape between these population blocks for Massasaugas, but the most permeable is not necessarily permeable enough to allow successful snake dispersal, particularly if one of these connectivity pathways is bisected by a high traffic road, or if it's just too long relative to the dispersal distance of the species. But these pathways do identify the best areas for interventions aimed at improving or restoring connectivity between habitat blocks. And to be clear though, any conservation interventions within these pathways, they won't benefit Massasaugas in the short term. I mean, we waited too long, there's too few left right now. Rather, these interventions ought to be conducted within the context of a broader, long-term captive breeding and augmentation initiative, which, by the way, is clearly supported by the provincial government response statement and by a number of other partners who actually recently collaborated on a much-needed boost of the captive breeding capacity via the addition of 52 new snakes from 3 separate districts across the last 2 years. So as these recovery efforts ramp up, we do need to actively design and restore a connected system of Massasauga critical habitat to improve the long-term viability of a future recovered Ojibwe population. So the National Recovery Strategy identified these 3 disconnected blocks of critical habitat for Massasaugas, 413 hectares in total at Ojibwe. 3 of our population blocks that we use in the study roughly correspond to these 3 critical habitat blocks, although ours actually followed the official plan boundaries. But our results could inform decisions about where to implement connectivity interventions to increase the chances that Massasauga critical habitat actually functions as this single integrated unit as opposed to these 3 disconnected blocks. And of course, given the likelihood of historical connectivity and the close proximity of these blocks, restoration of connectivity is a reasonable conservation goal. Also consider that Kudla et al. In 2021, they show that Massasauga gene flow is clearly possible at scales of up to 7 kilometers. When suitable habitat is abundant, habitat patches are close enough, less than 1 kilometer, and if the intervening landscape is traversable. So we did identify 6 potential links between critical habitat blocks. You can see them here based on the closest suitable breeding patches in each block. These links actually range from 860 meters to almost 2.5 kilometers. Now, that's quite long, considering that the max straight line seasonal migration we recorded at Ojibwe was less than 700 meters, and Durbin et al. In 2008 recommend, when restoring or enhancing habitat, to provide suitable conditions within 400 meters of hibernation sites. So we suggest that any functional connectivity between these population blocks will require successful reproduction outside of the blocks and subsequent intergenerational dispersal between blocks. So assuming that's the case, a connected system of Massasauga critical habitat will require the protection of these suitable breeding patches, minimum of 5 hectares, within the corridors themselves and outside of population blocks, sort of these stepping stones per se. And by comparing interpatch distance of these breeding patches to that 400 meter threshold that I mentioned, essentially we identified 3 of those 6 connectivity pathways which present the greatest likelihood of achieving a functionally connected unit of Massasauga critical habitat. That's PCP 1, 2A, and 2, you can see here. So these are the connectivity pathways that should guide our interventions as we move forward. Now we can combine those results, overlay them with detailed investigation of real world property boundaries, the built environment constraints, and ta-da, we come up with a corridor plan. So this map now becomes the guide to help focus these connectivity-based interventions on the landscape. These include habitat protection, eco-pastures and barrier fencing, brush piles, all that sort of stuff that we're actively working on. Now, there are many challenges that lie ahead to fully reconnect the land for Massasaugas, it's clear, but our work has provided the foundation for a landscape scale plan, a plan that I believe is possible and a plan that could soon become a reality. Check this out. Federal government just last month announced Canada's 2nd national urban park at Ojibwe Prairie. I mean, I can hardly believe it. It's amazing, and it appears that this is coming down the pipes. And Parks Canada investment could have an immense positive impact on our collective ability to protect, connect, enhance the lands we need to make our vision of connectivity a reality. Because urban land's expensive, so urban park design, it must be evidence-based. Now, the potential benefits of connectivity extend far beyond Massasaugas. Let's be clear, we have over 160 other rare species of local plants and wildlife that depend on tallgrass prairies down here. This landscape here was designated as an impera in 2016. and recently nominated as a Canadian key biodiversity area because it supports nationally significant populations of 20 trigger species in our nomination: reptiles, plants, insects. Some are found nowhere else in Canada. One insect is actually found nowhere else in the world. It's globally endemic here. So increasing connectivity for Massasaugas will pay conservation dividends on the entirety of this globally rare ecosystem. So wrapping it all up, we modeled connectivity for the Massasauga in an urban landscape using a cost distance corridor swap model. And then we evaluated those outputs with row mortality data. So connectivity models like this one are useful when applied to reptiles in urban landscapes because they, A, provide ecological evidence as a foundation for conservation corridor design. B, they help to prioritize potential corridors. And then C, they provide the justification for these expensive connectivity interventions. So a reminder, this was published in the journal Land in 2020. Go check it out. There's the website. The research will guide recovery of an endangered reptile in a globally rare ecosystem, and will also inform the use of connectivity models in other urbanizing landscapes. So with that, many acknowledgements to help make this work possible. I'm very thankful to all of them and thankful to all of you for listening. I'll take questions in the question period.
We'll start with a comment from Scott after Fred's talk, that he's found garter snakes in very shallow hibernacula, as little as 40 centimeters. So he thinks that their presence in most areas makes sense, and milk snakes seem to be in deeper hibernacula at his sites in southwestern Ontario. So either way, it's an interesting find, but he wonders if milk snakes are just exceptionally rare rather than being true range extension that you're seeing.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about so much of Canada is we have such a huge percentage of the range of so many species where they're very, very infrequent. And of course, it's only convenient to study them where they're relatively abundant. And yeah, the milk snakes may be rare. The thing about them here, now there's two sides to this. One is that Francis and Joyce and we have lived in the Bishop's Mills area for all these years and hadn't seen one until 2020. But on the other hand, at least on our land in Bishop's Mills, we've had one green snake in 40 years. But we know from Matt and Amanda and Judy Corteau and other people that there are places where green snakes are a lot more abundant than they are right in Bishop's Mills.
Only a few kilometers away.
Yeah, that's only a few kilometers away. So yeah, it's very hard to distinguish a range extension from real rarity, extreme rarity. And that's not the kind of thing you can study. I mean, we may need a whole different way of doing something with atlas data, because you can't, do a grant and say, well, I'm going to study this species that's incredibly rare over the whole area where I'm looking for it, because the granting agency isn't going to look favorably on that.
There. All right, thank you, Fred. Next, Nick, you were getting some compliments on your talk, particularly your work on overwintering strategy, and you did answer a couple of questions, but I wonder if you wanted to comment a bit more about the snow coverage over the time frame that you have it at your site.
Yeah, so that all came from Polly. The data I presented all came from Polly 2013, or Polly et al. But it shows basically March snow coverage and a loss of almost 6 million kilometers squared, mostly in the Great Plains in North America. Even in my time, I've been coming to Grasslands National Park since 2004. And even in my time, I've seen real differences in the amount of snow retention. Last year was the worst year I've ever seen living here in terms of snow. I wasn't quantifying it directly, but I was qualifying it because I had been watching a couple of lizards that I'd watched go under. They dug out a burrow, each dug out a burrow and then went under. And usually those areas would be covered in snow. This year they were not, and neither of them surfaced, so presumably they both died. Yeah, it's just it just seems like less and less snow each year, and most of our snow is actually blown snow. It doesn't really fall here. It blows from other places and then gets trapped on the east facing sides and in deep ruts and on fences. So there are certain areas where snow tends to pool here. And Larry and Powell and I have gone over this a number of times, and we both seem to think that that's probably a limiting factor for lizard populations in these areas.
Very interesting. Thank you. And then Johnny, there was a call to put your link for the article in the chat, but someone did. If you want to double check that's the right one, it looks good to us. But then there was a question, sorry, I just have to scroll through after people were clapping for your talk, Johnny. If anyone does have a question that they want to say out loud, if you want to do the raise hand function, you're more than welcome to. But first from Carly for John, is there any experience with rattlesnakes using culverts to cross under roads? And if so, are bridges preferred? That's for you, Johnny.
Yeah, we actually discussed that a little bit in the paper, and we provide some references for that, because we recommend that any future modeling actually reflect that in the land cover data. Like our roads were just uniform and classed based on traffic level, whereas you would expect the permeability of a road to be higher where there's culverts and bridges under those roads. And so as part of that discussion, we do provide some evidence of research that found snakes using culverts and bridges under roads. So there's a site that just comes to my mind about Massasaugas, and it was Mike Colley that did that work in Killbear, Massasaugas, and under road crossings. Jeff Rowe provides some evidence of fox snakes using under road bridges in his genetic work. He's sort of speculating that based on the genetics that he found, but that's some evidence there. And there's a few others, and you just have to look at the paper and you can get some references that way.
Awesome, thank you. So Nick just said that Fred, he's waiting for the first confirmed pale milk snake in Saskatchewan, so you give him hope. And Stephen Heckner, you've got your hand up. If you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for all those talks. They're really interesting. And all three of you fellows really did a good job there. I just wanted to ask one question of you, Jonathan, regarding the Ojibwe prairie complex. And it's certainly great to see that the work that people have been doing over the years, and then with our Impera designation, this is helping getting further protection, and it's looking pretty good that we're going to get some national recognition there. I can remember a little bit earlier on, there was a major impediment to connectivity in the Ojibwe area, and that was with what was going to happen with the Windsor Raceway property, and the plans were to be development of box stores in an area where they're not really needing any more of them. Has that idea basically gone away?
That idea has, no development has happened on that particular piece of land. So it's a piece of sort of brownfield land next to the provincial park component of the Ojibwe Prairie Complex. And there's a big OMB fight about that because there's species at risk on the site, and it would increase road traffic adjacent to the park. And this is what Steve here is referring to. So far, they got a permit, but nothing has happened on the ground. So I'm not sure. Of course, with the federal government coming in and proposing to buy land, there is the opportunity for them to actually buy lands like that and prevent that kind of development coming through. But just to go back to your original, so Steve and I authored the Impera nomination that got this landscape designated as an Impera site in 2016, and that's the actual boundary, Steve, that we used as a basis for the boundaries of the KBA application. So we just expanded it a little bit to include some of these, some of the endangered plants in our nomination, but essentially that provided kind of the framework that we worked off of. So it's great to see that sort of we're taking that Impera now to the next step and getting that KBA classification. But yeah, there's still threats in the landscape. There's still development proposals, still linkages in our plan that are under threat and have development proposals. And so it's really key that the feds come in and actually take a leadership role to maintain that connectivity in that landscape by buying land, essentially.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with the mayor of Windsor about a month ago and a couple other people from the city, and they were very confident that it looks like the national protection is going to come through. They, you know, they didn't say it officially, but they're very, very supportive, or at least that's what they conveyed to me.
The council did unanimously support an endorsement of our MP's plan. He proposed a plan for its national urban park. The city council endorsed it. They signed an agreement, almost like a memorandum of understanding with Parks Canada. And then there's a news release around that last month. Of course, there's a federal election and not every party has the same perspective. So I'm not sure every party's perspective on this, because it's a bigger national urban park expansion plan. It's 7 different cities and Windsor is one of them. So I'm not sure what the other parties feel about that and how the election will potentially influence that moving forward.
Could I make one comment to Nicholas just regarding some of his work before I go off here?
Of course.
Yeah, that area of research of the insulating effects of snow is very, very important, and it's really an area that's been understudied. We haven't really looked into that enough, especially in a place like Canada. But for a number of years at Primary Provincial Park, they were putting in sensors in the ground, just recording where the frost actually penetrates to. And it looked like for protection of the 5-line skink there, that they would have to basically get down to at least about 1 meter underground to get pretty good assurance of protection because of the variation from year to year. And I know it gets a little bit scary in talking to some colleagues in Minnesota, and Gary Casper there, I can remember him mentioning one time before that in some years where snow cover came late, they got frost penetration down deeper than 10 feet into the ground in some places. So that could be game over for a lot of the herps.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is one of the elements when I read Larry Powell's work on overwintering in this species in particular. When I got to the fact that all of his observed lizards didn't get any deeper than 10 centimeters down, I thought it was impossible for them to survive. From my perspective, they must be at least frost tolerant. But yeah, I mean, even with a good degree of snow cover, I would expect frost penetration down below 10 centimeters. But we've never put anything out, and I can't find anything to actually present that data. So yeah, it does seem like it's almost physically impossible. When Pam and I were putting eye buttons down into red belly hibernacula, we were going 1.2 meters to the water line, and it was freezing right to the water line. So I will be surprised if they actually maintain temperatures above freezing. In some ways, this project is also to give us some idea of the freeze tolerance of the species without actually putting the species at risk through the processes of getting freeze tolerance experiments, because we just don't have enough shorthorn lizards to be testing them and throwing them in freezers. So yeah, so it'll provide us a little bit of basic biology as well as some of the conservation issues associated with this species and this particular ecosystem.
Yeah, there's lots of people agreeing that it's important. And Pam is saying that there's a similar thing in Manitoba, that there's a lack of snow cover, and that's going to be a huge challenge. And there's a paper about the red belly hibernacula that has been published. And we also, everyone agrees with Pam that we want to thank you, Steve, for your work with the imparas. It's wonderful, fantastic work, and so great to hear that it's also being extended to other species. It's fantastic. And Carly's saying, thank you for your answer, Johnny. And there's another question for you. To what extent do the results of the modeling and potential to what extent the results of the modeling and potential corridors can be applied to other snakes or herp species in the same area? Is the matrix of habitat resistant to movement highly specific to your species?
Yeah, that's a good question, because any kind of connectivity analysis should be species specific, particularly because you are you're giving a suitability score to each land cover class based on your knowledge or the literature of that species. So yes, the results can be applied to other snakes to the extent that they use similar habitats. So in this landscape, I do feel like these results could apply to other snakes, particularly the 5 other snakes that use the tallgrass prairie, because they're using similar habitat. So the suitability scores, you could argue, would be almost the same for other species. So if I'm trying to use the model then for a yellow warbler or something, obviously it wouldn't really make sense, because they're going to have different, there's going to be different resistance levels for them in that landscape. But I would think yes. I mean, you have to look at your suitability scores and think about it for your other species and see if there's any reasons why that would be different. But for the most part, I would think the results, yes, would apply to snakes that use similar habitats in this landscape. And you could do a number of these with very different species, and then look at the overlaps in those potential connectivity pathways to even further guide corridors that are better for a greater sort of diversity of animals. But in our case, open habitat, tallgrass prairie habitat is preferred, and that type of habitat creating, enhancing, connecting that habitat will benefit, all the tallgrass prairie plants and these insects, and then potentially other snakes that use that habitat as well.
Awesome, thank you. There's another question for you, and Johan saying thank you as well. There's another question for you, Johnny. You only used road mortality data as presence data in the connectivity model. How about you answer that one first?
Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great if I don't have telemetry data for Massasaugas, unfortunately, but yeah. And so there's a clear limitation, is the assumption that the road mortality hotspots, or clear assumption rather, the road mortality hotspots are sort of indicators of attempted crossings, right? So that's the assumption here, is that where we're finding snakes dead on the road is where they're trying to cross, and the hotspots are therefore, indications of the locations of movement, right? So you could do it with telemetry data. I know there's fox snake telemetry data for this landscape that we could probably compare to our model, but for this particular purposes, it's just road mortality data. There's no recent telemetry data for Massasaugas available to test this out. And the road mortality data didn't even have Massasaugas. That's another thing, is we had to, there's so few, they're not getting killed on roads. So we had to use these 5 snakes as sort of proxies for where Massasaugas would also cross.